It was discovered by accident, buried deep inside a cardboard archive box marked Rural Education, 1890-1905. Inside were papers that had not seen daylight in more than a century, reports from forgotten inspectors, salary notes written in ink that had turned gray with age, and attendance ledgers bound with brittle thread that broke the moment they were touched. The photograph had been pressed between two such ledgers, its edges curled inward like a leaf preserved too long in a book. When the archivist pulled it free, a faint smell of coal smoke and old paper rose into the air, a ghost of the world it had once known. She placed it under the reading lamp, brushed off the dust with gloved fingertips, and felt a strange quiet settle over the room. It was dated in pencil on the back, 1900, no other writing, no studio stamp, no photographer's mark, only the faint trace of a thumbprint in one corner, a human touch that had survived every hand that had passed it along. The image was small, roughly 4 by 6 inches, printed on thick fiber paper gone soft at the edges. Its surface had yellowed unevenly, and fine cracks ran across it like tiny rivers of time. But beneath all that decay, the picture still breathed. It showed 20 children arranged on the stone steps of a one-room schoolhouse in rural Vermont. The steps were uneven, the stone chipped and pale with frost. Behind them, the school's clapboard siding caught the low winter light, and a thin line of smoke drifted from a crooked chimney at the side of the frame. Above the doorway, a hand-painted sign read, North Hollow District School. The bell rope hung slack beside the door, its frayed end frozen into a stiff arc. One could almost imagine the cold wind of that morning, how it must have stung their cheeks, how the photographer might have called out, "Hold still now, 10 seconds," and how the younger children would have trembled, their breath fogging the air in white clouds. The class was arranged in neat rows. The smallest children sat on the bottom step, their boots muddy and unevenly laced. The older ones stood behind, shoulders touching, the weight of discipline visible in their posture. At the far left stood the teacher, a woman in her 30s, her waist cinched by a dark skirt, her blouse high-necked and stiff, her hair pulled tightly into a knot. Her face carried no expression at all. It was not sadness, nor sternness, simply the absence of either, as though emotion had long ago been trained out of her. Her gloved hands were clasped before her. In the crook of her arm, a thin leather-bound ledger rested, the kind used to record attendance, late marks, and small punishments. The ink of her pen had left faint smudges across its cover. At first, the photograph looked ordinary, familiar even, like hundreds of school portraits from the turn of the century. Children posed in the cold, waiting for the click of a camera that would freeze them forever into the same gray eternity. But the longer one looked, the more that sense of normalcy began to unravel. The eyes of the children told the first story. Most stared straight ahead, blank and obedient, as though unsure what this machine of glass and brass was doing to them. A few squinted against the pale winter sun. One boy near the top row grinned faintly, his front tooth missing. But near the center of the group, slightly left of frame, a girl stood too still. She was small, perhaps 9 years old, with pale hair braided into 2 perfect ropes that fell evenly over her shoulders. Her dress was lighter than the others, freshly pressed, the pleats too crisp for a weekday. A narrow paper tag was pinned neatly to her collar, the ink faint but legible. Clara Holt. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers knotted together in a way that seemed painful. Her lips were pressed tight, her gaze not quite at the lens but just above it, as though she were looking at something behind the photographer. The longer the archivist studied her face, the more the stillness began to feel wrong. Not posed, but held. On the stone step beside the teacher, the ledger lay open. The photographer must have moved it slightly to make space for the shot, and in doing so captured a fragment of the handwriting inside. The names could still be read, though time had blurred the edges. Holt, Clara Holt, Edith, absent. The ink trailed off with a small blot, as if the pen had hesitated mid-stroke. That was when the archivist first felt the chill. She turned back to the girl, Clara, and noticed that her shadow was split. The sun had been steady that morning, its light soft and low, but behind her on the steps were 2 faint outlines overlapping like a double exposure. The children around her cast clean, solid shapes, only hers trembled. For a moment, the archivist thought it might have been a trick of the exposure, those long seconds of stillness that could make the slightest motion blur into ghostly transparency. She adjusted the lamp, tilted the photograph slightly, and looked closer. The girl's left hand, the one clasping the other, was faintly translucent. Through her knuckles, the texture of her dress could be seen, as if the image were folding in on itself. And yet the right hand was solid, perfect, real. It was the kind of imperfection a photographer would normally discard. But this print had been kept, preserved with care. Someone at some time had believed this one mattered. The archivist leaned back in her chair. Outside, the The winter wind tapped softly at the window of the Vermont Historical Society's reading room. The clock above the door ticked once, then again. She glanced back at the open ledger on her desk. There, across 2 brittle pages, the same hand that had written the attendance list had added a note in smaller, more hurried script at the bottom. March 7th, Edith Holt fell ill. Sister sent in her place for lessons. There were no other entries after that date. The archivist read the note twice. It was simple, factual, unremarkable, the kind of entry teachers made by the hundreds. But something about the phrasing unsettled her. Sent in her place for lessons. Not came alone, not continued study. Sent in her place. She looked again at the photograph. The pale girl, the clasped hands, the eyes that didn't meet the camera but seemed to stare into the space between moments. It was easy to imagine the day, the sound of the teacher's heels against the wooden floor, the smell of chalk dust and ink, the faint echo of boots against the frozen steps as the children lined up for their picture. Maybe the photographer had arrived from town, setting up his heavy tripod and glass plate, muttering about light and time. Maybe he'd said, "Hold still, 10 seconds. Maybe he'd never noticed that one child was standing for 2. Hours later, when the archivist finally turned off the light and locked the reading room, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had followed her out. That night, she dreamed of snow-covered steps and the hollow toll of a school bell that rang for no one. When she woke, she found herself thinking not of the photograph but of the note, that quiet sentence, written by a hand that had long since turned to dust. Sister sent in her place for lessons. What kind of lesson required one twin to stand for another? The next morning, she returned to the archive early, before anyone else arrived. The photograph was still there, waiting on the table where she'd left it. But something in it had changed. The faint double shadow behind the girl seemed stronger now, darker, more defined, as though in the soft dawn light of the room, it had been filled in by something unseen. She blinked, leaned closer, and then she saw it. The faintest curve of another figure, half hidden by the light. The suggestion of another braid. 2. She pressed her hand against the glass cover, her pulse quickening. For the briefest moment, the reflection of her own face merged with theirs. 20 children and 1 archivist, all suspended in the same quiet second that never ended. And in that breathless silence, she could have sworn she heard a voice, small, careful, almost polite, whisper from within the paper itself. I stood where she should have stood. That was how the story began. Not with an explanation, not with proof, but with the faint outline of a shadow that refused to fade. And a single question written in the cold light of 1900. Who did the camera truly capture that day? The girl who stood, or the one who stayed behind? The winter of 1900 came early to the hills of North Hollow. It arrived before the harvest was done, before the last apples had been gathered from the orchards, and it stayed longer than anyone could remember. The river froze so hard that wagon wheels cracked when they crossed it, and the morning frost turned the laundry lines into ropes of ice. In a small farmhouse at the edge of the valley, the Holt family lived in quiet endurance. Father, mother, and their 2 daughters, Clara and Edith. They were twins, born minutes apart, though no one could ever quite agree which had come first. Even their mother, in her exhaustion, had once said, "They came together." The clock didn't matter. They were identical at birth, same pale hair, same gray-blue eyes that seemed to belong to an older time. But by the age of 9, their differences had begun to show, not in their faces, but in their ways of seeing the world. Clara was practical. She liked order, the rhythm of chores, the sharp lines of handwriting, the comfort of doing things correctly. Edith was quieter, more restless, prone to looking out the window for long stretches as though she expected something, or someone, to arrive. The schoolhouse was a mile away, down a rutted path that turned to mud each spring. The girls walked it together every morning, boots damp from snowmelt, satchels clutched in gloved hands. They always sat side by side in class, their desks marked by the same initials carved years before by older children, AH plus CT 1887. They were good students. The teacher, Miss Kitteridge, often remarked that the Holt twins had a gift for remembering, though she never said what it was they remembered. When one recited a passage from Scripture, the other's lips moved silently in time. When one sneezed, the other flinched. It was a bond that made some of the other children uneasy. Once, during arithmetic, a boy named Amos whispered that they were half the same girl. Clara ignored him. Edith did not. She turned her head, looked at him for several seconds without blinking, and said in a voice that was too calm to be childish, "Then you should mind which half you're talking to." The class laughed nervously. Miss Kitteridge told her to sit down. By February, the air in North Hollow had turned to glass. People said you could hear it crack when the sun rose. Inside the schoolhouse, the iron stove hissed and popped as children thawed their mittens near the coals. The smell of wet wool and chalk dust clung to everything. That was when Edith began to cough. At first, no one thought much of it. Winter coughs were common in the valley, but by the second week, she was missing days. The doctor from Montpellier visited once, left a small bottle of dark medicine, and told their mother to keep her warm. Rest, he said, plenty of broth. No school until the fever breaks. But the fever did not break. By the end of the month, Edith had stopped eating. Her voice grew thin and distant as though it came from the far end of a long hallway. She would wake at night and ask strange questions about the clock tower in town that hadn't worked in years, or about whether snow kept falling when no one was there to see it. Her mother prayed aloud. Her father sat by the stove and sharpened his tools in silence. And Clara, every morning, still walked to school alone. Miss Kitteridge didn't ask questions. She simply nodded when Clara arrived, handed her lessons for 2, and said, "You tell your sister she's missed." So Clara told her. Every night, sitting at the edge of the bed where Edith lay half awake, she would whisper the spelling lists, the sums, the lines from Pilgrim's Progress, and Edith would nod faintly, as though she already knew them. One morning, as the light crept through the frost-covered window, Edith's eyes flicked open. "They'll be taking the photograph today," she murmured. Clara frowned. "How do you know?" Edith's voice was soft. "I dreamed the bell rang 3 times. It always rings once, but this time it was 3. "You're talking nonsense," Clara said, though her throat felt tight. But when she reached the schoolhouse that morning, the bell rope did hang low by the door, and the photographer's wagon stood outside, its black curtain drawn, its brass lens gleaming faintly in the cold. The children were lined up on the steps, fidgeting. The photographer, a thin man with a trimmed beard, gave quick, sharp instructions in a Boston accent. "You there, miss, straighten your collar. Hands folded, miss. Eyes here, please." Miss Kitteridge placed a small box on the bottom step and began pinning paper tags to each child's coat. "We'll have names this time," she said, "for the district record." When she reached Clara, she hesitated. "Where's your sister?" "She's home," Clara answered. "She's sick." The teacher's expression softened, but only slightly. "I'm sorry to hear it." She pinned the tag anyway. "Clara Holt." Then she paused. "Should I mark your sister as absent?" Clara's fingers twisted in her sleeve. She thought of Edith, pale against the pillow, whispering about bells. She thought of her mother's weary eyes. Then she said quietly, "She told me to stand for her." The teacher blinked. "To what?" But before Clara could answer, the photographer called, "All set now, folks? Hold still. 10 seconds, that's all." The bell rang once, then twice, and on the third toll, the shutter opened. When the flash cleared from her eyes, Clara felt as if the world had tilted. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw Edith beside her. Not solid, not there, but reflected somehow in the glass of the lens, her face half-formed in the light. Then it was gone. The children filed back inside. Lessons resumed. The stove hissed. No one spoke of it again. That evening, as the sky turned to copper over the fields, Clara returned home. Her mother met her at the door, her hands wrung with worry. "The doctor came again," she said softly. Clara ran to the bedroom. The bed was empty. The window stood open, letting in a draft that made the curtains tremble. Her father's hat lay on the chair, and beside it, a folded piece of paper, the school's attendance ledger. Across its top, in the teacher's hand, was written, "March 7th, Edith Holt fell ill. Sister sent in her place for lessons." Below it, in another shakier line of ink, a note that had not been there before. Photograph taken. 20 present. That night, Clara dreamed she was standing on the school steps again. The bell rang above her, though no one pulled the rope. The snow fell silently, filling her footprints before she could turn to look back. And just before waking, she heard Edith's voice, faint and steady, whisper in her ear, "You did well. They can't tell the difference." But when she awoke, her pillow was damp, and her name tag, the one she had worn in the photograph, lay folded neatly on the bedside table. The ink had bled slightly, as though it had been handled by a hand too cold to be alive. For several weeks, the photograph rested inside its protective sleeve at the Vermont Historical Society, filed neatly under Rural Education, 1900s. The archivist, whose name was Lydia Crane, found herself thinking of it more often than she cared to admit. It was not unusual for her to form quiet attachments to objects. After all, her days were spent among the dead. But this one was different. This one seemed to watch her back. Each morning she passed the row of glass cabinets, the smell of paper and linen glue rising in the still air, and paused by the table where she had first examined it. There was always a slight chill there, even when the rest of the room was warm. By the third week, she began to notice small inconsistencies. The photograph had been digitized for the museum's archive, but every new scan looked subtly different. The grain shifted, the contrast deepened. In one, a child's ribbon had slipped lower. In another, a faint shape appeared near the edge of the frame, a blur curved like a braid caught in motion. She ran the files through the scanner again and again, comparing them pixel by pixel. No error, no corruption. The data was clean. Yet something was changing, not in the machine but in the photograph itself. One evening, long after closing, Lydia stayed behind to review the records of North Hollow District School. Most of the documents were gone, lost to fire or time, but a few fragments survived. One was a census record listing 21 names. Another was a handwritten note from 1901, sent to the county board. Enrollment reduced to 19 following illness and closure. 19, but the photograph had shown 20. She turned back to the image. Under the lamplight, the girl in the center, the one labeled Clara Holt, seemed clearer than before, her features more defined, the light catching the sheen of her braids. Lydia's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Behind Clara, in the narrow shadow between two boys, a faint silhouette had appeared. It wasn't dust. It wasn't damage. It was the outline of another child, fainter, smaller, its edges dissolving into the grain like smoke. Lydia leaned closer until her reflection merged with theirs. For a moment she thought she saw movement, the flicker of breath behind the glass, the subtle parting of lips. Then the lamp above her flickered once, casting the faintest ripple across the image. When the light steadied, the second figure was gone, but in its place a new detail had emerged, something she hadn't seen before. On the teacher's ledger, propped on the bottom step, the ink blot at the end of the line had spread slightly, as though still wet, and within it, she could now make out the faint impression of another word, written in the same neat cursive, present. Lydia stepped back, her throat tightening. She checked the metadata again. The digital timestamp confirmed that the image hadn't been altered since the scan, but what she saw now hadn't been there before. That night she dreamed she was standing on those same school steps, the air sharp with the smell of wood smoke and iron. The bell above the schoolhouse swayed soundlessly. The children stood frozen in their rows, eyes wide, unmoving. Only the girl in the center breathed. Her hands were clasped exactly as in the photograph, but this time there was something in them, a small ribbon, pale as bone, fluttering though there was no wind. Lydia tried to speak, but the sound came out as frost on her lips. The girl lifted her head and whispered, not to her but to someone beside her, someone Lydia couldn't see. "Stay still," the girl said. "They'll never know." And then the shutter closed. When Lydia woke, her apartment felt colder than it should have. The streetlights outside cast pale bars of light across the wall, and in the silence between them, she could still hear the echo of that bell, dull, distant, and hollow. She went to work early the next morning. The photograph was waiting on the table right where she had left it, but something about it had changed again. The crack in the paper that once ran along the right edge had split wider, revealing a glimpse of the original mounting board beneath, and there, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line. They said 20 came that day, but 21 left. The words haunted her. She spent the next week searching through public records, church logs, anything that might mention the Holt family. The census listed them as farmers, 4 members. By 1905, the record read only 3. By 1910, 2. Then she found a death certificate dated March 7, 1900. Edith Holt, pneumonia. But beneath the physician's signature was a note in faint graphite, written by someone else, perhaps the clerk. Burial delayed. Family requested additional day. An additional day, the same date as the photograph. That evening, Lydia returned to the archive one last time. The building was empty. The air hummed with the low murmur of the heating pipes. She set the photograph beneath the lamp, the light soft and amber, and stared at it for a long while. The children seemed quieter now, more distant. Even the snow at their feet appeared deeper. Yet Clara Holt, still in the center, still clutching her hands, seemed almost alive, her eyes holding something that was neither sadness nor fear, but a kind of waiting. Lydia whispered, "What were you waiting for?" The glass of the frame fogged faintly, as if in response, and then she saw it, the faintest reflection of herself overlapping the girl's face. For one impossible instant, she felt warmth beneath her palm where it rested on the frame. It was like touching the pulse of time itself. She removed the photograph carefully and flipped it over. On the back, beneath the faint pencil date, another mark had appeared. It was smaller, fainter, as though written by a hand too light to leave much trace. "I stood for her." Lydia froze. She turned the photo upright again, heart hammering. The girl's eyes seemed to be looking straight through her now, as though the barrier of glass and paper no longer mattered. Then, without realizing why, Lydia whispered aloud, "Who took the photograph?" And from somewhere deep within the silence, somewhere that felt older than the air around her, she heard a voice, not loud, not even distinct, but close enough that she could feel the breath of it. Not who, when. The lamp flickered once more. The room dimmed, and in that dimness, for the briefest second, Lydia thought she saw the faint outline of two girls standing side by side. The next morning, the museum director found Lydia asleep at her desk, the photograph laid gently across her chest. The digital files of the image were open on her monitor, but the data no longer matched the print. On the screen, there were 21 children. In the photograph, still curled in her hands, there were only 20. When asked later what she remembered, Lydia said she could recall almost nothing. Only that she had heard the bell 3 times and that someone had whispered, "We're all present now." After that day, she never worked in the archives again. But before she left, she donated one thing to the collection, a small folded paper tag she claimed to have found on her desk the next morning. It read in fading ink, "Edith Holt." For months, the photograph of the North Hollow class remained locked in the museum's preservation vault. The file was officially catalogued, sealed, and forgotten, as if the act of assigning it a number could drain it of its unease. But objects, like memories, do not rest because we tell them to. They wait. They linger until someone looks again. In late spring, a graduate student named Henry Blake requested access to the archive for his thesis on early educational photography. He was meticulous, quiet, and endlessly patient, the kind of person who treated every object as if it could bruise. When the archivist on duty handed him the file marked H0271, 1900, Vermont, District School Photo, she warned him with a small smile, "That one tends to haunt the interns." He laughed politely, thinking she was joking. He carried the folder to his workstation, unfastened the archival clips, and laid the photograph under the cool light of the lamp. His first thought was how ordinary it seemed. 20 children, 1 teacher, the faded architecture of an old wooden schoolhouse. He adjusted the light, tilted the frame, and began to make notes. Then he noticed the girl in the center. Her name tag was just barely legible, Clara Holt. He typed it into his notes and froze, because when he checked the attendance list, scanned as part of the file, there were 2 Holt entries, one marked absent, one marked present. He frowned. A clerical detail, surely. Yet something about the phrasing unsettled him. The same phrasing Lydia had once circled in her notebook. Sister sent in her place for lessons. Henry leaned closer, tracing the faint outline of the girl's braids. The photograph had been scanned at high resolution. He could see every grain, every imperfection in the emulsion. But there, between the 2 braids, something wavered. A soft blur, curved like the echo of another face. He adjusted the exposure, lifting the shadows. The form became clearer, a faint profile beside hers, tilted toward her as if whispering. And behind it, barely visible, the shimmer of 2 ribbons instead of 1. He rubbed his eyes, looked again, and found the image unchanged. The rational part of his mind began its work. Glass defects, double exposure, early shutter drag. But as he studied it, another thought crept in, one that logic couldn't quiet. What if it wasn't a defect at all? What if the camera in that long exposure had caught something that was not of the moment, but of the memory? He turned the photo over, expecting to see nothing but the usual archive marks. Instead, he found a line written faintly in graphite, the same looping hand as before. "She learned her lessons. I only held her place." Henry stared at it for a long time. The graphite shimmered faintly under the lamplight, as if recently written. But the back of the paper was brittle, flaking at the corners, untouched for 100 years. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the steps of the schoolhouse, the uneven stone, the bowed heads, the girl in the center with her hands clasped so tightly it hurt to look. He dreamed that he was standing in front of the same door, the bell rope hanging beside him, frost gathering on his sleeve. The world was silent except for the sound of breath, shallow, cold, uneven. From inside the schoolhouse came the faint sound of chalk on slate, a child's voice reciting, "Lesson 3, I am present." He opened the door. The desks were empty. Only the faint chalk marks remained, loops and letters traced by a hand that trembled. And then, on the far wall, something else, a faint reflection, like light caught on glass. 2 girls stood there, one slightly behind the other, one pale, one paler. The one in front turned her head slightly and whispered, "Don't let them forget the name." When he woke, his notebook lay open on the desk, though he didn't remember leaving it there. Across the top page, written in his own handwriting but in a line he couldn't recall writing, were the words, "Absent does not mean gone." He returned to the archive the next day. The staff greeted him kindly, unaware of his unease. He asked to see the photograph once more, claiming he needed to verify dimensions for citation. The archivist obliged. When he placed it under the lamp again, something felt wrong. The edges were darker than before, not from time, but from shadow. The teacher's ledger, once closed in the image, now appeared slightly open. The ink inside gleamed faintly under magnification. Henry tilted the photograph. The word on the page caught the light, the same word that had appeared and vanished for Lydia years before. Present. He whispered it aloud, testing how it felt in his mouth. Present. The light above him flickered once, and in that brief stutter of darkness, the surface of the photograph reflected his own face, pale, half merged with the girl's. For a moment, it looked as if she were breathing through him. Then the light steadied, the reflection broke. Henry left the archive that evening and didn't return. He emailed his advisor the next morning, saying his thesis topic no longer felt appropriate. He didn't explain why. But a week later, a package arrived at the museum addressed to Vermont Historical Society, at 10 Collections Department. Inside was a single page from his notebook. The paper was creased, as if folded many times. The handwriting was his, but uneven. Hurried, it read, "The photograph shows 20 children, but every time I look at it there is one more. I think she's still learning." The photograph, now stored under stricter archival conditions, has since been reprinted for the museum's upcoming exhibition, Ghosts of the Turn of the Century. Visitors who pass through the dimly lit gallery often remark that the North Hollow photograph feels different from the others. They describe a soft hum, or a trick of the light, or the feeling of being counted twice. But no one can say exactly what they see, only that when they step close enough, the girl in the center seems to look past them, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the present, into a time that has not yet finished happening. And if you linger too long before the frame, your reflection merges with hers. The air feels a little colder, and somewhere, from a century away, a bell rings 3 times. Time, as it always does, moved forward, but the photograph did not. It remained caught in the amber of its own moment, suspended between light and memory. Years turned into decades. The North Hollow schoolhouse was torn down, the land parceled off, and the stone steps carried away for use in another building. But the image endured quietly, as though the act of looking at it gave it reason to stay. By 1952, the photograph resurfaced in a local newspaper. The article was small, printed beside a column about winter fairs and lost dogs. The headline read, "Forgotten Vermont School Photo Spark Search for Descendants." The editor had reprinted it after finding it in a chest donated to the Historical Society by a farmer's widow. Beneath the image, the caption read, "North Hollow, 1900, class of 20, names unrecorded." But in the original margin of the print, barely visible to the naked eye, there were names. Someone had written them in pencil, decades earlier, each letter trembling with age. Among them, Clara Holt, and, faintly beside it as if added later, Edith. No last name, no mark of distinction, just a single word written softly into the paper, as if the two names were meant to be spoken together. People who saw the photograph in the paper began to write letters to the editor. Most offered no leads, only memories. "My grandmother went to a school like that," or "I had an aunt named Holt once." But one letter stood out. It came from a woman named Helen McDowell, who lived 2 towns over. She wrote in slanted blue ink, "I believe the girl in the middle was my great-aunt Clara. My mother used to say she had a twin who died when they were small, but she always claimed that her sister's name was written in the school's records, as if she had still gone on learning without her." The letter ended with a single line that the editor later underlined in red. "My mother said that every year on the first snow, the bell of that schoolhouse used to ring, even after they pulled the rope down." The newspaper dismissed it as local folklore, but the archivist who read it, the same one who handled the photograph years later, kept a copy of that letter in her desk drawer. Over the next half-century, the image continued its quiet journey, from newspaper archives to museum catalogs, from glass slides to microfilm, and eventually to the pale blue glow of digital screens. Each reproduction lost something, the warmth of the paper, the weight of silver, but gained something else, reach. Now, it could be seen by anyone. And it was. When Veilside Stories first featured it in their series on forgotten photographs, the video spread quickly. People commented that the girl in the center looked alive, that her eyes seemed to follow the narration, that you could almost hear a bell ring faintly at the end. Others said the opposite, that the image looked different each time they watched it, as if one more child had joined the class between views. In a small town north of Montpelier, an elderly woman named Ruth Everett saw the video late one night. She paused it at the exact frame showing the close-up of the name tag pinned to the girl's collar. "Clara Holt," she read aloud. Her voice shook. She reached for an old family album and pulled out a sepia portrait from 1921. Her grandmother as a young woman sitting on a porch holding a little girl in her lap. On the back, written in her grandmother's hand, were 2 words, "For Edith." No one in her family had ever known who Edith was. The name had been spoken once, then folded away into silence. A week later, Ruth visited the museum in Montpellier. She asked to see the original photograph. The curator led her into the reading room, the same one where Lydia Crane had worked all those years before. The air smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. When the photo was placed on the table, Ruth felt her breath catch. It wasn't just the faces, it was the air inside the picture, the texture of the light. It felt like stepping into a memory she didn't know was hers. She leaned closer, tracing the faint outlines of the children. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heating vents. And then, very faintly, she heard it, the sound of a bell. 3 slow tolls. She blinked, looked up. The air in the room seemed to shimmer. The reflection on the glass wasn't hers anymore. 2 girls stood there instead, side by side. One whispered something Ruth couldn't hear. The other smiled, not with her mouth but with her eyes. And then they were gone. The museum security camera footage from that evening shows only Ruth seated at the table, perfectly still. The light flickers once. When it steadies, she stands, places a small folded note beneath the frame and leaves. The note remains in the archive to this day. It reads, in a careful, wavering hand, "I was wrong. It was never about who was present. It was about who was remembered." Now when visitors come to the museum and stop before the North Hollow photograph, some say they feel something beneath their feet, a soft vibration, like the distant hum of a bell tower, long since fallen. Others say the air feels heavier, as if someone unseen is counting the seconds between heartbeats. But most notice something quieter, a warmth, a pulse of humanity, an invisible connection to those forgotten faces. And always, at the center of the photograph, the same small girl stands, her hands clasped, her name tag pinned just so. Her eyes hold the kind of stillness that only comes from waiting too long to be seen. When you look closely, you might see it too. The faintest shimmer beside her, a twin shadow just out of focus. And if you listen, in that breath of silence between the words, you might hear it. The soft sound of a bell that still rings for those who were marked absent. Veilside Stories, where every photograph remembers what the living forgot. If this story stayed with you, unsubscribe. There are more voices waiting in the light.